Howdy, I am Chelsea Seeley Fruber and decided to read some of my favorite childhood book, The Gunslinger. It's a seven-part series, seven-book series by Stephen King. And I read it. Yeah, it was really amazing. I read it like continuously in high school, like later high school, and definitely went into another world. And it was like influenced a lot of my art and my views, even to this day. So, yes, and I love Stephen King. So, this is a great one. And I'm not even sure. I do have other parts books in this series. I'm not sure if I have all seven, but we'll see as I get started in this one. And yeah. So here we go. The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger by Stephen King. Illustrated by Michael Whelan. And then you got a contents page with different chapters. The Gunslinger. There are good pictures in here too. I'll try to include those as well. Here's the first one. And I'll just read however much I feel like, and I'll do it in parts. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. The desert was the apotheosis of all deserts, huge, standing to the sky for what might have been parsecs in all directions, white, blinding, waterless, without fear save for the faint, cloudy haze of the mountains which sketched themselves on the horizon, and the devil grass which brought sweet dreams, nightmares, death. An occasional tombstone sign pointed the way. For once the drifted track that cut its way through the thick crust of alkali had been a highway, and coaches had followed it. The world had moved on since then. The world had emptied. The gunslinger walked stolidly, not hurrying, not loafing. A hide water bag was slung around his middle like a bloated sausage. It was almost full. He had progressed through the Keth over many years and had reached the 5th level. At the 7th or 8th, he would not have been thirsty. He could have watched his own body dehydrate with clinical, detached attention, watering its crevices and dark inner hollows only when his logic told him it must be done. He was not 7th or 8th. He was 5th. So he was thirsty, although he had no particular urge to drink. In a vague way, all this pleased him. It was romantic. Below the water bag were his guns, finely weighted to his hand. The 2 belts crisscrossed above his crotch. The holsters were oiled too deeply for even this Philistine, sun to crack. The stocks of the guns were sandalwood, yellow and finely grained. The holsters were tied down with raw hide cord, and they swung heavily against his hips. The brass casings of the cartridges, looped into the gun belts, twinkled and flashed and heliographed in the sun. The leather made subtle creaking noises. The guns themselves made no noise. They had spilled blood. There was no need to make noise in the sterility of the desert. His clothes were the no color of rain or dust. His shirt wasn't open at the throat, with a rawhide thong dangling loosely in hand-punched eyelets. His pants were seam-stretched dungarees. He breasted a gently rising dune. Although there was no sand here, the desert was hardpan, and even the harsh winds that blew when dark came raised only an aggravating, harsh dust like scouring powder. I want to make sure. I want to make sure you can hear me okay. I didn't put on my headphones, did I? Okay. Never mind. He breasted a gently rising dune. Although there was no sand here, the desert was hardpan, and even the harsh winds that blew when dark came raised only an aggravating harsh dust like scouring powder, and saw the kicked remains of a tiny campfire on the lee side, the side which the sun would quit earliest. Small signs like this, once more affirming the man in black's essential humanity, never failed to please him. His lips stretched in the pitied, flaked remains of his face. He squatted. He had burned the devil grass, of course. It was the only thing out here that would burn. It burned with a greasy, flat light, and it burned slow. Border dwellers had told him that devils lived even in the flames. They burned it, but would not look into the light. They said the devils hypnotized, beckoned, would eventually draw the one who looked into the fires. And the next man foolish enough to look into the fire might see you. The burned grass was crisscrossed in the now familiar ideographic pattern and crumbled to gray senselessness before the gunslinger's prodding hand. There was nothing in the remains but a charred scrap of bacon, which he ate thoughtfully. It had always been this way. The gunslinger had followed the man in black across the desert for 2 months now, across the endless, screamingly monotonous, purgatorial wastes, and had yet to find spore other than the hygienic, sterile ideographs of the man in black's campfires. He had not found a can, a bottle, or a water bag. The gunslinger had left 4 of those behind, like dead snake skins. Perhaps the campfires are a message spelled out letter by letter. Take a powder, or the end draweth nigh, or maybe even eat at Joe's. It didn't matter. He had no understanding of the ideograms, if they were ideograms, and the remains were as cold as all the others. He knew he was closer, but did not know how he knew. That didn't matter either. He stood up, brushing his hands. No other trace. The wind, razor sharp, had of course filed away even what scant tracks the hard pan held. He had never even been able to find his quarry's droppings. Nothing. Only these cold campfires along the ancient highway and the relentless rangefinder in his own head. He sat down and allowed himself a short pull from the waterback. He scanned the desert, looked up at the sun, which was now sliding down the far quadrant of the sky. He got up, removed his gloves from his belt, and began to pull devil grass for his own fire, which he laid over the ashes the man in black had left. He found the irony, like the romance of his thirst, bitterly appealing. He did not use the flint and steel until the remains of the day were only the fugitive heat in the ground beneath him and a sardonic orange line on the monochrome western horizon. He watched the south patiently toward the mountains, not hoping or expecting to see the thin, straight line of smoke from a new campfire, but merely watching because that was a part of it. There was nothing. He was close, but only relatively so, not close enough to see smoke at dusk. He struck his spark to the dry, shredded grass and lay down upwind, letting the dream smoke blow out toward the waste. The wind, except for occasional gyrating dust devils, was constant. Above, the stars were unwinking, also constant. Suns and worlds by the million. Dizzying constellations, cold fire in every primary hue. As he watched, the sky washed from violet to ebony. The fire threw strange shadows as the devil grass burned its slow way down into new patterns. Not ideograms, but a straightforward crisscross, vaguely frightening in its own no-nonsense surety. He had laid his fuel in a pattern that was not artful, but only workable. It spoke of blacks and whites. It spoke of a man who might straighten bad pictures in strange hotel rooms. The fire burned its steady, slow flame, and phantoms danced in its incandescent core. The gunslinger did not see. He slept. The two patterns, art and craft, were welded together. The wind moaned. Every now and then, a perverse downdraft would make the smoke whirl and eddy toward him, and sporadic whiffs of the smoke touched him. They built dreams in the same way that a small irritant may build a pearl in an oyster. Occasionally, the gunslinger moaned with the wind. The stars were as indifferent to this as they were to wars, crucifixions, resurrections. This also would have pleased him. 2. He had come down off the last of the foothills, leading the donkey, whose eyes were already dead and bulging with the heat. He had passed the last town 3 weeks before, and since then there had only been the deserted coach track and an occasional huddle of border dwellers, sod dwellings. The huddles had degenerated into single dwellings, most inhabited by lepers or madmen. He found the madmen better company. One had given him a stainless steel silver compass and bade him give it to Jesus. The gunslinger took it gravely. If he saw him, he would turn over the compass. He did not expect to. 5 days had passed since the last hut, and he had begun to suspect there would be no more when he topped the last eroded hill and saw the familiar low-backed sod roof. The dweller, a surprisingly young man with a wild shock of strawberry hair that reached almost to his waist, was weeding a scrawny strand of corn with zealous abandon. The mule let out a wheezing grunt, and the dweller looked up, glaring blue eyes coming target center on the gunslinger in a moment. He raised both hands in curt salute and then bent to the corn again, humping up the road next to his hut with back bent, tossing devil grass and an occasional stunted corn plant over his shoulder. His hair flopped and flew in the wind and now came directly from the desert, with nothing to break it. The gunslinger came down the hill slowly, leading the donkey on which his water skin sloshed. He paused by the edge of the lifeless-looking corn patch, drew a drink from one of his skins to start the saliva, and spat into the arid soil. Life for your crop. Life for your own, the dweller answered and stood up. His back popped audibly. He surveyed the gunslinger without fear. The little of his face visible between beard and hair seemed unmarked by the rot, and his eyes, while a bit wild, seemed sane. I don't have anything but corn and beans, he said. Corn's free, but you'll have to kick something in for the beans. A man brings them out once in a while. He don't stay long. The dweller laughed shortly, afraid of spirits. I expect he thinks you're one. I expect he does. They looked at each other in silence for a moment. The dweller put out his hand. Brown is my name. The gunslinger shook his hand. As he did so, a scrawny raven croaked from the low peak of the sod roof. The dweller gestured at it briefly. That's Zoltan. At the sound of its name, the raven croaked again and flew across to Brown. It landed on the dweller's head and roosted, talons firmly twined in the wild thatch of hair. Screw you, Zoltan croaked brightly. Screw you and the horse you rode in on. The gunslinger nodded amiably. Beans, beans, the magical fruit, the raven recited, inspired. The more you eat, the more you do. You teach him that? That's all he wants to learn, I guess, Brown said. Tried to teach him the Lord's Prayer once. His eyes traveled out beyond the hut for a moment, toward the gritty, featureless hardpan. Guess this ain't Lord's Prayer country. You're a gunslinger, that's right? Yes, he hunkered down and brought out his makings. Zoltan launched himself from Brown's head and landed, flittering on the gunslinger's shoulder. After the other one, I guess. Yes, the inevitable question formed in his mouth. How long since he passed by? Brown shrugged. I don't know. Time's funny out here. More than 2 weeks, less than 2 months. The bean man's been twice since he passed. I'd guess 6 weeks. That's probably wrong. The more you eat, the more you toot, Zoltan said. Did he stop off? The gunslinger asked. Brown nodded. He stayed supper, same as you will, I guess. We'd pass the time. The gunslinger stood up and the bird flew back to the roof, squawking. He felt an odd, trembling eagerness. What did he talk about? Brown cocked an eyebrow at him. Not much. Did it ever rain, and when did I come here, and had I buried my wife? I did most of the talking, which ain't usual. He paused, and the only sound was the stark wind. He's a sorcerer, ain't he? Yes. Brown nodded slowly. I knew. Are you? I'm just a man. You'll never catch him. I'll catch him. They looked at each other, a sudden depth of feeling between them. The dweller upon his dust-puffed dry ground, the gunslinger on the hard pan that shelved down to the desert. He reached for his flint. Here, Brown produced a sulfur-headed match and struck it with the grimed nail. The gunslinger pushed the tip of his smoke into the flame and drew. Thanks. You'll want to fill your skins, the dweller said, turning away. Springs under the eaves and back. I'll start dinner. The gunslinger stepped gingerly over the rows of corn and went around back. The spring was at the bottom of a hand-dug well, lined with stones to keep the powdery earth from caving. As he descended the rickety ladder, the gunslinger reflected that the stones must represent 2 years' work easily. Hauling, dragging, laying, the water was clear but slow-moving, and filling the skins was a long chore. While he was topping the second, Zoltan perched on the lip of the well. Screw you and the horse you rode in on, he advised. He looked up, startled. The shaft was about 15 feet deep, easy enough for Brown to drop a rock on him, break his head, and steal everything on him. A crazy or a rotter wouldn't do it. Brown was neither. Yet he liked Brown, and so he pushed the thought out of his mind and got the rest of his water. What came, came. When he came through the hut's door and walked down the steps, the hovel proper was set below ground level, designed to catch and hold the coolness of the nights. Brown was poking ears of corn into the embers of a tiny fire with a hardwood spatula. 2 ragged plates had been set at opposite ends of a dun blanket. Water for the beans was just beginning to bubble in a pot hung over the fire. I'll pay for the water, too. Brown did not look up. The water's a gift from God. Papa Doc brings the beans. The gunslinger grunted a laugh and sat down with his back against one rude wall, folded his arms, and closed his eyes. After a little, the smell of roasting corn came to his nose. There was a pebbly rattle as Brown dumped a paper of dry beans into the pot. An occasional tack, tack, tack as Zoltan walked restlessly on the roof. He was tired. He had been going 16 and sometimes 18 hours a day between here and the horror that had occurred in Toll, the last village. And he had been afoot for the last 12 days. The mule was at the end of its endurance. Tack, tack, tack. 2 weeks, Brown had said, or as much as 6. Didn't matter. There had been calendars in Toll, and they had remembered the man in black because of the old man he had healed on his way through. Just an old man dying with the weed, an old man of 35. And if Brown was right, the man in black had lost ground since then. But the desert was next, and the desert would be hell. Tack, tack, tack. Lend me your wings, bird. I'll spread them and fly on the thermals. He slept. 3. Brown woke him up 5 hours later. It was dark. The only light was the dull cherry glare of the banked embers. Your mule has passed on, Brown said. Dinner's ready. How? Brown shrugged. Roasted and boiled. How else? You picky? No, the mule. It just laid over, that's all. It looked like an old mule. And with a touch of apology, Zoltan ate the eyes. Oh, he might have expected it. All right. Brown surprised him again when they sat down to the blanket that served as a table by asking a brief blessing. Rain, health, expansion to the spirit. Do you believe in an afterlife? The gunslinger asked him as Brown dropped 3 ears of hot corn onto his plate. Brown nodded. I think this is it. And I'm going to stop it for there. So that was 1 through 3. Yeah, that was 1 through 3. I'm going to stop it for there for now. And I'll continue this in parts.